Good evening, afternoon, morning. I'm Maisna Marnapal. I and my co-host Girija welcome you all on behalf of the Advanced Research Consortium Library and Archives to our 22nd lecture series. We're very excited to have Dr. Edward Munitl, who will deliver a lecture on colonial biographies in Northeast India with a special focus on T.C. Hudson's works. Um, a few words about our community. The Advanced Research Consortium Library and Archives became a public library and archive in 2022. The archival collection consists of rare manuscripts, commonly known as puyas. Some of them are as old as the 16th century, rare photographs. We've also got first copies of the books written about Manipur and Northeast India in general from the 19th century and early 20th century. The library, on the other hand, is ever expanding. We've been acquiring books across genres and disciplines. The library is located in the heart of the city, Imphal city. If you want to become a member, we'll share the Google registration form. It takes less than 2 minutes to become a member, and a membership fee is just 200 rupees uh, per year. With that, you get access to a reading space and a borrowing facility of 3 books at one time. And I'll introduce my co-host, Dr. Khonjam Girija. She holds a master's in political science from the University of Delhi. Her past associations include a human rights education training at the National Human Rights Commission in New Delhi. She was also earlier with the summer research program or summer school at the Highland Institute in Kohima, Nagaland. And she is one of the active members of the ARCLA community. Over to you, Girija.
Yeah, thank you. So before I introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Edward, let me lay out some rules, housekeeping rules for the talk. So the talk will be in English and the same will be followed for the question and answer session. The session will be live streamed and the duration of the talk is 35 minutes and 20 minutes for the Q&A. Audiences are kindly requested to mute their mic. So about our guest speaker, Dr. Edward Moon Little is a social anthropologist with diverse interests across academia, museums, and tech. As an academic, Edward has a passion for the history of anthropology and teaching anthropology. He was awarded the PhD from the University of Cambridge in the year 2022 on his thesis titled In the State of the Kangla, Kingship and Revivalism in Northeast India. Edward is also a fellow at the Highland Institute, Kohima, where he works at the summer school, donates books, and helps curate exhibitions. He also has a strong interest in market research, having conducted projects for leading technology companies, including Apple, Meta, and Google. Currently, he is affiliated to the South Asia Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Over to you, Edward.
No, thank you so many people for coming and giving up your Sunday evening. I'd like to do a special thanks for such a lovely introduction and to Wangom Somajit. And when you first come to Manipur as outsider, you're incredibly ignorant of manners, of history. And I've always had such generosity in teaching me so many things to learn, so much about Manipur. And Wangom Somajit has been a wonderful colleague. He's been very generous. When I had an exhibition in Manipur, he gave advice, he gave translations. I'm really impressed with everything, he's spearheaded and the collective he's built around him. So thank you very much. I'm not a historian by trade. My time in Manipur, I was busy bothering Pantals, the sort of men who sit on their golden thrones of Pakangba, here and there throughout the state. But I have I have an interest in the history of anthropology because it's a discipline I was trained in, and also because my university, the University of Cambridge, has had a long relationship with Northeast India, a very mixed relationship, and many scholars of Northeast India then had their professional careers at the University of Cambridge, which is how I came upon this topic. So thank you so much, everyone. So the talk, everyone can see my slide, right? The opening slide. Yeah, great. T.C. Hodson's Confession and the Challenge of Colonial Biographies in Northeast India. All right. So, as a moderately successful man in 1921, T.C. Hodson was traveling in America. He worked a little bit for the University of Michigan, like many itinerant academics at the beginning of their career. And he was interviewed by kind of a very preppy American reporter. And in the middle of this interview, he said, I have a lurid, unprintable past and no future. And this is a successful family man, outwardly very successful, has written books, has worked at top universities. And I was really intrigued by this remark and why anyone would kind of make it. The reporter, very preppy, optimistic American man, said meeting T.C. Hodson disproved the American fallacy that Englishmen have no sense of humor. And so I think this is where I'm starting off. This is sort of the confession that tumbled out. And when I heard the confession, I'm not a psychoanalyst by any way, but it seems deeply, deeply Freudian to say something so self-negating, self-deprecating, unprompted in an interview that's just like a puff piece. It's meant to make you feel good, people feel good. And I was like, oh, this is deeply Freudian, this sort of like tumbling out, this utterance. And Freud in his like early 20th century book, the about everyday life. He said, like, a suppression of a previous intention to say something is this indispensable condition for the occurrence of a slip of a tongue. This idea of a Freudian slip, these utterances, like we might want to keep secrets about ourselves and about things we've done in our life, about our shame, but they kind of come tumbling out. I thought that was a really interesting way to think about T.C.'s Hodson claim that have a lurid past, a lurid, unprintable past, and no future.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Edward, but the slides aren't moving yet.
Ah, the slides aren't moving. That
Yeah.
why? Oh, interesting. Why is that not moving? Mm-mm-mm. Okay. Oh, it's good. Good you told me now, so I can see them moving nicely on my screen, but they're not moving. All right. Better to have a technical
It,
problem at the start, I
it's not
suppose.
moving.
Yeah. So let me try and share again.
Yeah, that's sure again.
Um, okay. 1 second. I think it might be something to do with me having my notes up. We did have a tech rehearsal, so I'm sorry, people, for this flaw. It's seemed to have escaped through. But let me 1 second.
I've made you the co-host, so you will have more access probably. Now you can,
Okay,
yeah. Let's share it once again. Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Now it's visible.
Um, Slideshow mode. I just want to be able to access my notes. So you can see that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I get my notes up at the same time? Mm-hmm. Which one am I presenting? Slideshow. Present view. So what slide can you see now? The intro slide, right?
Yeah, I have a lurid unprintable pass. Yeah.
Great. And now a new slide, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So obviously a picture of Freud. So starting off again, um, I thought what Hodson gave in that interview in 1921 in America, this very jolly interview, he cuts it through this very odd remark, completely out of place, and it seemed like a real Freudian slip, a suppression of something hidden inside you, an occurrence, something you try and repress that then comes out. And Hodgson did have some dark things that he did in India. And I think this is really what he's referencing that interview. It's hard to ever know what the Freudian slip reference is, but I think it's particular actions by him, and his career in India ended in disgrace. He might have had a very good career after India, going to the University of Michigan, teaching at Oxford, working for the British government again, holding a chair at the University of Cambridge, the William Wyse chair that's become very prestigious. But his career in India ended in disgrace due to his own actions. So I wanted to look at that Freudian slip and then look at his career. And when writing kind of a biography of a single colonial figure, or any figure, there's kind of the conventions of biography suggest that you're writing it so your audience sympathize with the figure, that they're kind of the hero of the story, the hero of the narrative. And when I made my first draft of this paper, a friend from Assam who read it was saying, "Oh, it feels like kind of glorifying the anthropologist," which is what I was trying not to do. So I tried to think, how do you do biography? Because intellectual biography, I think, is quite useful for understanding disciplines, understanding how the way we understand the past emerge, understand the perspectives people write from. How do we do it in different ways and really kind of show that it's not meant to be hagiographic, it's not meant to be kind of endless praise. So I was thinking, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Strange Case, um, was a nice way of kind of looking at Hodson's time in Manipur. Throughout his life, he was often very well liked with people, but he also had this monstrous side. And by centering this kind of metaphor, this literary metaphor, and going beyond maybe more familiar frames for dealing with colonialism, like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or George Orwell's Burmese Days, which is often referenced when telling anthropological histories, I thought I would position The Strange Case of Dr. Jack and Dr. Hyde, of Mr. Hyde, as a way of understanding Hodson, understanding his career, his time in Manipur. I liked it also as it's a novel about the late 19th century, about the time Hodson was alive. It's written and it frames the sort of same time period he operated in. I think it can help understand that, yeah, a man can be so incredibly well liked in field, but also be truly monstrous at times. And it's interesting. The novel's a great reflection on the duality of man, and it allows me to take seriously in the archive when people wrote very glowing things about Hodson, but also the really dark things he did. To be able to hold both at the same time together. Because academically, for those not interested in Northeast India, he's not like a hero to be knocked down in anthropology because he's a really minor figure in the way the history of the discipline's taught and the way the history of the discipline's written. So generally, anthropologists of Northeast India feel that the anthropology of Northeast India has been a bit ignored, a bit marginalized, a bit relegated when people write histories of anthropology in the UK and they teach histories of anthropology. Um, because so much early anthropological work was done in Northeast among the Nagas, among the Kukis, in Manipur, across Assam, the Karbis, etc. But when people non-area specialists have written about Hodson, he certainly isn't some like illustrious hero to be knocked down. In fact, they don't care. He's a marginal figure. So Adam Cooper called him an uninspiring ex-India civil service officer. So that's how it appears in that account. Um, Called a mediocrity in another account, and a sort of caretaker. So in the history of anthropology, he's a very minor figure. But for us meeting today, and taking this from the Arc Library Instagram account, he remains interesting for those who work on Northeast India or trace some of his ideas because the books he wrote have been very influential. They're kind of cited in so much of the following literature. And I think if you take maybe the classic, the kind of post-colonial classic, The Religion of Manipur by Parrott, she cites 5 different works by Hodson. And she doesn't take them as blanket evidence, but she carefully weighs each of his claims against existing rituals, against other colonial texts, against Puya, and um, and I think it shows that that even though he had a very difficult legacy, it's very hard to kind of his texts prove to be foundational. They need to be grappled with one way or another. So on the kind of classics beats of biography, Um, Hodson was born in 1871. In the 1880s, he went to a very kind of elite British um, private school called Christ Hospital. And I think one of the things that's often missed about Hodson, Mills, and Hutton, the early ethnographers of Northeast India, is they came from a tiny, tiny proportion of Britain. They all went to very elite um, private schools, all had a very similar education, like deeply Anglican, deeply ritualized, deeply based on sports, deeply segmented by gender, segregated by gender. And then they went on to Oxford University, where they have more rituals. They all read a very set, narrow canon of classical texts, amongst other things. And then they enter the Indian Civil Service, which in 1893 is a tremendous thing. It's like being an IAS officer now. It's in often called one of the hardest exams in the British Empire. Hodson passes, and then he becomes the Assistant Chief Commissioner, Sir Henry Cotton, in Shillong. Now, Cotton's a really interesting character, and I think he can, his career in India started in a very kind of conventional way, but by the time he left, he wrote a famous book advocating for Indian self-rule. He's established friendships with the Tagore family and Swami Vivekananda, um, and he had a very interesting career to have moved from, colonial domination, colonial knowledge production to someone who, once they left India, really questioned why the British were there, why colonial rule should happen. And this was Hodson's first boss in Northeast India. We worked as assistant commissioner. And Cotton doesn't leave many notes about Hodson, but he remembers Hodson as unusually quick and clever at acquiring frontier languages. Hodson has his first, he moves up from Calcutta into Shillong, and this is his first experience in Northeast India. He starts collecting kinship data about the Qazis and starts making his own notes and working on his own publications. And this is where his interest in Northeast India and anthropology really begins. It's not in Nagaland, it's not in Manipur, but it's in Shillong. And under Cotton at this time, it was really cracking down on the tea planters of Assam. He became an advocate for the rights of coolies, and Hodson worked under him. Then in 1897, there's a terrible Assam earthquake, a quake so terrible it damaged every stone house in Shillong. And T.C. Hodson is there as one of his first jobs, working on clearing up and restoring. Then he gets his move to Manipur. He arrives at age 27, so still quite a young man. He's had those few years in Assam, a few years beginning anthropology, and he arrives in Manipur, an incredibly turbulent time. And this is one of his pictures he took. I think it's of the Princess uh, Sanatombi. It's now housed at the Royal Anthropological Institute. If anyone's in London, you can see many of Hodson's original photos there. And he arrives in Manipur not long after 1891, not long after the British invasion, a tremendous amount of destruction, a tremendous amount of loss of life, and a change in the political order. And he moves from Cotton, this man who's beginning to open up and gain more liberal ideas to empire, to someone a bit more traditional, Colonel Maxwell, who's famous in Manipur for his marriage to the Metis princess. That's recorded in many popular works of fiction. And this is how Hodson's career begins in Manipur, and this is how he starts researching the books he later publishes. So he's now there doing kind of his daily work as a member of the British colonial administration, and he starts collecting ethnographic data, he starts interviewing people, he starts learning the languages, and he has two kind of main lives. So he has his life in infile, where he's going snipe shooting and doing the sort of things colonial officers do, go to Loktak Lake and shoot waterfowl. He's overseeing court cases. He's meeting minor royalty. He's attending to a lot of paperwork, and then he does these tours around Manipur. And when he comes to Manipur, he brings the complete Britannica dictionary, and he brings a magic lantern slide, a magic lantern set with a slide very much like this. So when he goes and tours the hills, he sits down in various villages and he provides like a night's entertainment. He is, in that capacity, he is judge, administrator, ethnographer, and then he has this extra role for himself as sort of evening entertainment. And this is he makes reference to one of the slides he took was this slide where it's a moving slide and it's an endless reel of a man swallowing a rat. And he said this was a massive hit with his Naga audiences up in the hills. And he sits at night and he interviews people. And this is where he starts beginning to collect the literature that goes into the Naga tribes of Manipur. And one evening, when he says the conversation was exhausted, he asked people in one Naga village, out of all the things they saw, what was the most impressive? And they don't pick the magic lantern slide, but they pick the rupee coin. The fact that the empire can make so many of these coins and they all look the same, indistinguishable from each other. And Hodson's reflection on this is the amazing diversity of linguistic forms amongst the Naga people that capture all the different classes of objects, all the different classes of experience, so many of which Hodson writes in English we group together as one. So it's kind of a time of methods research. He starts learning the language. He starts studying manuscripts, the pre-colonial manuscripts, the Kingly Chronicle, the Puya. He also does, I think, some racial measurements, the ones that eventually, I'm holding up the book, but you can't see me, that enter the Meti are drawn from other sources, but he takes part in that kind of racialized colonial science um, takes place. Um, and that is part of his work that's aged really badly. It was built on awful assumptions. It was built to further the whiteness of empire and the whiteness of colonialism. But then he also starts thinking a bit more about what is anthropology? What can it do? And one of his quotes, I think that many people know, is in Manipur, where Hinduism is a mark of respectability, it is never safe to rely on what men tell you of that religion. The only test is to ascertain what they do, and by this test, we are justified in holding them to still be animists. So this is one of his kind of reflections on the method or what you should be doing in anthropology. And this is probably one part of his thinking that's held up well, is that really good social science research, whether it's in development, sociology, anthropology, is empirical, You can record what people tell you they do, but it's really about their actions in daily life that shows their values. And as we come on to it, like Hodson's actions were were really awful towards the end of his time in Manipur. And despite a lot of lovely things he wrote about the Northeast and it's about its people, his actual actions undercut it. One of his other big quotes is he had a really big interest in the Puya because he was never in Manipur very long. It never developed into a great study, but shooting the sun is in the Meti, and there are references to textual sources. And one of the liberal or more open-minded quotes about his views on Northeast India, which is quite different from how a lot of people saw Indian history and Indian sense of historicity at the time. There were a lot of debates among colonial officials, like, can such a thing as history exist in India before the British came? But for Hodson, he's really impressed with like historicism. He's impressed with the Kingly Chronicles. And he says some of the passages are as dull as parish magazines, others are full of good stuff. But I'm profoundly convinced that by the strictest modern test, there is plenty of good history here. And much of it is good direct history. There are dates, precise dates, years, months, and day to satisfy the most stringent modern dry as dust historian. There's real life in it. So he leaves really impressed with the writing culture of the Manipur Valley, the learning, the historical continuity. But his study is cut short. And this is one of the telegrams that cuts it short. It ends it. We are sending by present mail a dispatch recommending removal of service of Mr. Hodson, a civilian of 6 years standing in Assam for shooting a native and giving a grossly untruthful account of the occurrence when called upon for official explanation. So only 6 years Hodson spends in India. And I think this is quite interesting when we think about his work and reviewing it and how we weigh his claims. He spent a very, very small amount of time really in Manipur. As a reviewer, Colonel Shakespeare wrote of one of Hodson's paper, he never even saw Liharoba during his time in Manipur. It was cut short because of this awful act. So in 1899, Hodson was still in Manipur, but was in trouble. His wages had been docked already before this telegram for abusing his power. So during a case brought by Hodson's colleague, Brojo Nath Banerjee, who I believe is also credited with translating the Kingly Chronicles, Hodson had whipped one of the plaintiffs in this case. So the case centered around permission to dwell in Manipur for Indians from other parts of the subcontinent. So the kind of successor before inner line permits. Several Bengali plaintiffs have chosen to be represented by a local advocate, Chandra Kishore Das. When presenting in court, Das had the misfortune of Hodson misunderstanding his papers and trying to have him removed. Das vocally objected to his injustice, and Hodson later admitted that he was incensed by Das's defiance. He ordered Das to be taken to jail and beaten, a punishment colonial officials were entitled to enact under the auspices of an odious act called the Whipping Act. So, question about Das's wrongful punishment the following year, a complete, abuse of power by Hodson. Hodson mounted a weak defense. He tried to argue that he had the beating stopped, the confusion around his narrative of the events, and Hodson maintained he sent Das to jail to shield him from the humiliation of being beaten in front of a large crowd of Manipuris and Nagas. Which is an awful, awful thing to say, to pretend you're doing someone a favor by putting them in jail. So Hodson's already in deep trouble for that anger. And I think earlier on I had the quote next to Jekyll and Hyde from his biography that one of the biggest impressions he left on anyone is his kind of two sides of his personality. And despite being already abusing his powers and being told off by the Raj, Hodson, again, in January of 1901, he's in Senapati district, and Colonel Maxwell, married to the Manipuri princess, is away from Manipur. But he begins to hear rumors that Hodson has killed a coolie while on tour. So a coolie is someone from the cookie community who's been conscripted as a porter to serve the colonial regime. Maxwell wrote to Hodson asking him to deny the rumors and confirm that no such events had taken place. Hodson could not, and this was the beginning of the end of his career. He was meant to tell Maxwell as his commander that as soon as the incident had taken place, but he didn't, and he tried to cover it all up. Later, Hodson was forced to admit that he shot at one of his cookie coolies, a man named Pullar, Palur, and he was unable really to defend his actions. Hodson maintained he didn't know if the bullet had hit this gentleman Pilar. Again, a very strange assertion. And piecing together the events of the day, nearly all parties eventually agreed that Hodson fired the gun in a fit of rage. And this happened in a cookie village in Dolan in Senapati. So what appeared to happen, piecing together the accounts from various sources, was Hodson felt his servants were being insubordination, and in that moment, as a colonial man, to try and reassert the dominance, the violence that underpinned the colonial regime, Hodson fired his gun. Hodson claimed he fired it to frighten the man, but he was hit by the bullets. He fell. The man fell, hit his head on a rock, Um, from what I can tell from the accounts, eventually the man survived, but it was an absolute shocking abuse of power. It shows Hodson's complete like inability to be put in positions of power due to this rage. And so the British administration slowly turned into action. Maxwell had actually covered up for Hodson, and therefore lost a lot of his credibility in the eyes of the British Raj. And eventually it went up to the very top of the British Raj, the most senior civil servants in charge. And they wrote a long report about Hodson, and they said, we proposed his removal, not so much for the act of shooting a native, culpable as it was, but because, and then it has a very, very colonial turn of phrase, because even good men in the country are apt, in fits of uncontrollable temper, to do strange things and violent things. But, in a kind of predictable, shocking way the British Raj operated, it wasn't the fact that he shot someone, but it was because of the deliberate way he carried it up and refused to comply with his superiors and try to hide the facts. They went on to say, I really believe that people's idea of honor and justice gets perverted this climate. The most ridiculous and inadequate punishments are, when an Englishman is concerned, proposed for the grossest and most unpardonable offences. So Hodson's Act came at a time where there were several similar cases across the British Raj. The letter continues, you remember the case of Sir Arthur Havelock and the offences in the riots in South India. Sir John Woodburn was equally weak over the Chapra and the murder cases. And the contagion even covers a wider circle. You remember that the Maharaja of Bhurtpur shot his body servant dead. The maximum penalty that Curzon, who was a chief civil servant of the British Raj, inflicted was proposed he should be deprived of a certain number of guns. So the Raja kills his bodyguard, and the best the Raj do is say, oh, you can have less guns. So Hodson's part of a wave of violence by men in the colonial system, mainly colonial officers, but also some native elites who see themselves as above the law and believe they'll only get kind of the weakest punishments for their outrages. Um, and the report ends on Hodson about the need to fire him quickly and get him out of India. Is so widespread is this laxity and so dangerous that it must be unchecked. It is essential for the government of India to maintain the highest possible standard of public honor and veracity among its servants. And it is a scandal. So this is an Oriya paper, so from Orissa, and this paper, the British monitored all kind of what they'd call native reports, native papers, to check how the Raj was being perceived. And this paper said this made the news. So what happened in Manipur made the news in Orissa. The case of Mr. Hodson, the late political agent of Manipur, was compelled to retire on a pension. So he's still pensioned, which is outrageous. He shot at a cookie coolie. And it concludes that the Raj has one sort of justice for one class of men, white, colonial, native elite, and another sort of justice for another men. So what happens in Senapati becomes a talking point across Manipur, into Assam, across Bengal, into Orissa, and as the top British servants realized, it was damaging the prestige of the Raj, is damaging the kind of social contract of the colonial system, the pretense that violence is accountable. So Hodson's fired. And this is why he spends only 3 years in Manipur. This is kind of why he never saw Lai Haroba, why the Naga tribes of Manipur is such a strange cut up book, is because he retires in disgrace. Still with a pension, he goes to Shillong, he goes to appeal his case, he complains of ill health, he complains of losing teeth, but the Raj will have none of it. And I think when Hodson talks about that lurid past, it is kind of that sense of shame coming up that his career ends in disgrace, um, that he has committed these acts of violence against Bengali plaintiff, this cookie man, maybe others, and that it becomes the talk of not just kind of elite Raj circles, but it becomes the talk of like an India vernacular press, that is hungry for like self-determination, hungry for liberation, hungry for decolonization. So that's the end of his time in Manipur. So during his time there, what type of things was he interested in? So his career professionally was a failure, but we still left with his books that are still used in much scholarship across the region. Um, there's a great new book on animal lives in Northeast India, with Joy Rote and William Van Schendel, Joy Pachu, from JNU. And like that book has maybe five, six references of Hodson. Many new books in the region continue working with his material. So the things he was interested in and the kind of beliefs he left field with, he wrote a lot in the following years, following his expulsion from India on reincarnation. So he was very interested in the returns of names in family units, so being named after a grandfather, tree marriage amongst the Santals, and he became interested in the belief that society is composed of constantly recurring units. So he's interested in how reincarnation appeared across non-Hindu groups in India or less Hinduized groups, and how when names appeared across generation, you had the structure of kinship brought across time. And he became a key early writer on kinship. His writing kind of shaped by this belief that the play of purely economic forces is so closely intertwined with social forces, the whole must be regarded as a whole. And he wrote a lot about Hinduism's relationship with other cultural strands in Manipur, but also among kind of tribal communities more broadly in India. So he's kicked out of the British service, he returns to Britain, he gets married, and then he hops from job to job, and then he writes his two famous books that many of us on this call will know well. So he writes, first he writes a book on cookie grammar, comes out in 1905. Then the Methes come out in as he wrote it in 1908, the Metis, and the Naga Tribes of Manipur comes out 3 years later, 1911, and then two later works appear: The Primitive Cultures of India, 1922, and the Indian Census Ethnography, 1937. But while he's sitting and writing in this kind of 1910s, these accounts with a mixture of empirical data, this kind of desire for observation, taking seriously the literature of Manipur. He's also still kind of working with these cultural categories that are being debunked in American anthropology. So around the same time, British anthropology is really focused on race and the way race supports the colonial project. In America, pioneering anthropologists like Franz Boas are working in New York with the migrants from Europe, from Sicily and from Ireland and from Scotland flowing into Ellis Island, and they're debunking race through a series of like major early studies that show how so many things that are seen as racial traits are really cultural traits, and that after two generations or one or two generations in America, people change so much change that identity has a higher plasticity than given credit for. And they're really debunking and pushing forward like much more liberal, much more scientific ideas, while Hodson and many of his British compatriots are really rooted in these kind of older racialized ideas. In the UK, there's a big push now under new anthropologists like Malinowski that diffusionism's dead. You know, we're not looking at how one idea spread from place to place. Hodson, as a linguist, remains really interested in that. He's a man who coined sociolinguistics. So he's trapped between camps. He's not quite a diffusionist, but he's not quite a non-diffusionist like Malinowski. Malinowski says anthropology should not focus on the quest for origins. If you read Hodson's work, he's interested very much in the quest for origins in a very kind of distinctly South Asian way, but how the idea that there are some ancient cultures in India that filter up into his Hinduism or filter into current forms. So becomes a bit out of step with British anthropology, and he becomes out of step with American anthropology. The First World War gives Hodson a chance that I think he's been waiting for since his disgrace to serve king and country again. You know, as I said at the start, he attends this very elite public school education in Britain of Oxford and Christ Hospital, where king and country is drilled into you again and again and again, or then Queen Empress. And the Second World War provides a chance to re-enter British service, and he goes to France eventually. He works in the forestry division. And he says one of the highlights of being in France is he bumps into, entirely by chance, the Tankle Labour Corps ammunition depot. And he says in his kind of big break 6 months ago, he managed to meet them and they all conversed in Métis. So they all spoke Metalon in the Labour Corps. And in a very kind of funny, patronizing, colonial way, he remarks on how good their Metalon is, rather than with the expectation that it would not be as good as his. So after the Second World War, he's got his major publication, First World War, he has his major publications out. Um, he has kind of made peace maybe a little bit with himself after returning to imperial service. And he starts one of the more positive chapters in his career, that he collaborates with some of the Indian pioneers of Indian anthropology, people who work on anthropology as Indians for Indians. He works with the wonderful Sarat Chandra Roy, who was originally a lawyer, then a legal activist in Jharkhand, what we call Jharkhand now, what was called Chotanagpur there, who wrote famous books on the Mundas, the Irans, the Bihors. And Sarat Chandra Roy uses some of the language of colonial anthropology, he uses some of the frameworks, but he's very interested in what anthropology can do for India, what it can do for social justice, what it can do for upliftment. So they have the journal Man of India, and Hodson becomes a really keen supporter of it. He writes many pieces, and Man of India is edited by Sarat Chandra Roy. And this is an interesting period where anthropology in India starts much more serving Indian needs, Indian interests, Indian editors, and the older generation of colonial administrators like Hodson become supporters, they take a back role. And another earlier Indian anthropologist, also born in what is now Bangladesh, like Sarat Chandra Roy, Majumdar, I believe, studies after Hodson, and he's one of the people who thanks Hodson for his work. We also have some early writings on Manipur by Manipuris. There's one in the Calcutta Legal Review on the legal systems in the Manipur Valley, where Hodson's work is now critically assessed by Manipuris for their own ends, for their own intellectual and academic goals. So a few years later, he's really on the edges of his career. He writes his last books that aren't so great on census ethnography and focuses on teaching. And that's kind of how his career ends. His children actually became very famous academics in the UK, but in the literature that followed him, his biography by Hutton, his obituary by Hutton, rather, not biography, there's no mention about that dismissal from the Raj. Maybe people knew and they were being polite and they kept it a secret, but I think in many ways that kind of lurid, unspeakable past did become was kept successfully as a secret by Hodson throughout his later career. And it had a really big impact on how he wrote about Manipur, the limitations on his research, but also that Jekyll and Hyde, that he could work brilliantly with Indian anthropologists, but he could also be a real abuser of his power in the system. And the last slide is a sort of different slide. I'm sure many of us have been here to this wonderful temple. And I'm just going to read in stop sharing and go back on screen. I got my first edition copy of the Metes from Katrina, who's on the call. And Katrina's mother, Ursula Graham knew Hodson, and she wrote a lot about the Zemi of Assam, Manipur, and Nagaland. And she knew him when he was at Cambridge. And in the back of her edition, actually, there is a story which is not out in the public domain. Katrina had a little bit of regret because she didn't know the story was in here, and then she gave me the book, and then she couldn't take it back. And I'm just going to end about this story about Hodson's time there. And I'm just going to read it out verbatim. Professor Hodson told me this story in 1939. A certain officer stationed in Manipur had an affair with, or had been living with, a Manipuri lady of high family. She had visited the temple, but was denied permission because of her association with the officer. She returned in a passion and complained to him, and he took a number of sepoys and visited the temple, I believe on the excuse of searching for arms. During that visit, he desecrated the sanctuary, pouring whiskey over the altar, among other things. He was assisted by orderly and possibly another man. I don't remember. The priests made a complaint to Hodson, then assistant political agent. The political agent was on tour, fishing in the barrack, I believe. Hodson told the officers to consider himself under arrest, a pronouncement which he resented extremely. Eventually, on Hodson's advice, the officer paid heavy compensation to the temple for the necessary purification ceremonies, and the matter was considered closed. After a while, the officer returned with a number of sepoys to Shillong, marching all the way, which took some 3 weeks. He'd been gone some while, maybe 10 or 12 days, when Hodson, out for a walk, found a large crowd round the officer's bungalow. As he approached, he heard someone shout, "The goddess has been avenged." On his arrival, the crowd dispersed, and no one could tell him anything except the officer was dead. He went at once to the telegraph office and asked the babus if they had heard any news, as the babus often gossiped along the line when things were slack, but the men swore they had not. The news was now all over Imphal, no one knowing how it had come. Hodson telegraphed to Shillong to know the officer was dead and received a sharp reprimand in reply. About an hour later, Shillong wired again. Investigate your source of information, X, died, followed by date and place. It appeared that the officer had gone duck shooting on a jill, accompanied by some orderly who went to the temple. On his return, he was taken ill, as was his orderly, and both men died within a few hours, apparently of cholera. I believe on the same day that the news was received in Imphal. He was at least 10 days from Imphal when this happened. In spite of minute inquiries, no connection was established. No Manipuris could ever be found near the officer camp. It was never discovered how the news came to Imphal or who shouted at the officer's bungalow. I do not know whether choral inflection was ever traced. I believe about the shrine at that temple. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. My talk is now completed. In short, Hodson, dangerous and bad man, monstrous like Jekyll and Hyde, well loved by some, but I think it speaks to, the danger of systems where men, particularly young men, are given huge amounts of power and are unaccountable, something which still affects all of us in many different places.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
you're audible.
Yeah. Thank you so much. These are all unheard tales about Hodson that most of us haven't are unaware of. And also, the only text I've read so far is a Maite by Hodson, and as a Maite myself, I feel very uncomfortable. Maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it would have been very different. At its point, reading the Maites, the way how the civilized primitive binary is created, all those civilization narrative, those colonial narratives and colonial gaze still continue, and especially I was just observing the language, the expletives that changed during the current conflict. Much of what people are saying about each other reflects the kind of language that Hudson used in his book, and not just Hudson, but many other anthropologists at the time. But yeah, thank you so much. I'm sure your talk has evoked interest in a lot of other people, and especially the last story that you shared was quite sensational, and I've never heard of it, even from the greatest historians who have read Hudson extensively. Now I'll open the session to everyone. We have around 20 minutes. What time is it? Yeah, we have around 20 minutes for Q&A. Any questions, any observations?
I have one interesting reflection on the language that when I was in field, I saw a Facebook post from a Bishnupuri activist who complained Hodsonian scholars were dividing Manipur. And his
Mhm.
interpretation of the book is that Hodson had overemphasized how non-Hindu, how animistic beliefs had survived in Manipur and had divided the true Hindus up. And he had listed a
Mm.
number of subsequent scholars from Manipur as Hodsonians for, you know, not rejecting some of the Metis or the Manipur Valley's Hinduized origins. So it's interesting, it's interesting the different ways uh, people interpret the book and people I spoke to who are in the scheduled tribe demand, how they saw some of those narratives as primitivism as kind of a bedrock for pushing for ST status for the Metis. So all these books can, within interpretation serve so many different political projects. They've just become resources to be re-edited and pushed into new contexts.
Thank you. And also for a lot of people here who don't have a background in anthropology, I mean, the difference that you made about the American Anthropological School and the British and the different take on race, it was quite interesting. Yeah. Thank you. So the floor is open. People,
Am I allowed to ask questions?
go ahead.
Edward, great to see you again.
Thank you very much for coming on Sunday evening.
Sunday afternoon for me. I have two questions. One is a very precise one, the other is kind of speculative. The precise one was, could you share the document where you find the Tangkhul conversation with Hodson during the First World War?
I can send it. I think it's a review of Pettigrew's book. So
Okay.
Pettigrew releases his book on Tangled Length, and I can't remember the journal, but Hodgson reviews it. He has lots of complaints about it, but he says it's generally pretty good, and then he shares this little anecdote. So I think it's there.
Yeah, because it's an interesting collection of photographs at Aras. And there is one particular photograph which intrigues me, where there is a group of Tangkhul tribesmen, and the document is signed, the photograph is signed saying, our Manipur Labor Corps about to dance. And obviously, as someone who's interested in performance studies and anthropology, that seemed a very interesting kind of moment, that why are these labor corps people wanting to dance? So I thought that maybe if the document by Hodson is also there is some connection because he's describing his time with the Manipur Labor Corps. It can sort of maybe not very neatly sum up activities during the war. So is that a Pettigrew's
Yeah, I think it's a review, but I
review?
think Hodgson met them very briefly. Higgins probably had much. Higgins notes released by John Parrott are really fantastic. Really on a par with anything Hodgson wrote. Maybe better. Maybe maybe there's more on dancing there. But great question. And
No,
what's a speculative question?
the speculative question is, you see, now that, again, I'm also not trained as a historian, as an anthropologist, but now that I am looking at multiple archives, including the South Asia archives at Cambridge or the VNA, and as you said, so many of the colonial administrators officers who have worked in Assam, Burma, Manipur, Nagaland, they left these detailed accounts. Of course, they stand for a particular period of time, the tonality, their racist stance, pitting tribe against tribe, it's sort of there. And it's almost like, they are making these disparaging demarcations while they're writing their notes. And then when you said just now, 5 minutes back, that, how some of these interpretations rear its head at the most sensitive moment in political conflicts, where some people now would take on those documents and then they would claim these kind of connections. When you approach so many of these biographies or these historical history of anthropology, where would you be starkly putting all of them in that same category as you did for Hodson and also partly Maxwell, as a Jekyll Hyde position? Because we also know that so many of them were products of the British Administrative Service. Is because the way they write, the way they image, the way they frame photographs, the way they borrow descriptions from the rest of other colonial administrators, some of them don't make sense in Manipur, Assam, history of Manipur and Assam. So that's where I'm sort of speculating, is how accurately should we see their history writing?
I think one of the interesting things about accuracy is we have recordings of like a lot of these papers were first talks in London. And one of the things interesting that comes out in Tom Simpson's book on Northeast India is when people gave talks, it was surprising how many people in the audience had also knew a bit about Northeast India, who had been in Northeast India. There'd been so many like former soldiers or, you know, political agents' wives, and this kind of touring culture that when people wrote about Northeast India, they didn't write about it with an ability to create anything because as Hodson writes something and John Shakespeare's like, you never seen La Heroba, there's an accountability there in the writing that their audiences, there's not many, but there's a handful of people who really know about the Northeast at lots of these venues they present at. Just like Pettigrew writes something and then Hodson responds. So I think the dismissing inaccuracies is harder because it is a place where there's a surprisingly large amount of people who may not have written so much but do know about Northeast India and a lot of them firsthand. And I think in that Calcutta Review article from 1921 is maybe one of the first meta sources I see, where someone's citing Hodson and their ability to like cite him where they agree with him, but also like challenge him and add to it. So that's like 9 years or 10 years after the publication of his book. So it comes pretty soon afterwards. That there is like not just kind of an audience of like very informed people in the UK that are like you have to convince about your writing, but also there's an increasingly like literate audience. And it's just a shame we don't have more newspapers from the period. So I think they'd have a lot more reflections um on things. I tried to go to the early Methi archaeologist Yamjal Singh's house in Imphal and see if he had any personal papers around and things like that. But I couldn't find any, because I'm sure, he would have had lots of thoughts on Hodson when he wrote that book on Pettigrew about accuracy of things. So I think it's pretty soon after this stage, unlike the earlier stage, you have people writing in like a public sphere who can corroborate and check things. So they might have been Jekyll and Hyde personalities, but I think there is like an emerging public sphere that checks the veracity of like claims.
Yes, Catriona, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Yes, not a very deep question, but just something that occurred to me. Do you think that Manipur was particularly badly served by its colonial officers? There seem to have been quite a number of extremely nasty incidents in its history. And would there be any explanation for that? And was it just bad luck that these Jekyll and Hyde types were sent there? Or was it something to do with the environment when they got there that was difficult to handle?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think think the political culture of Manipur has always been extremely rich in debate. A fellow colleague from Northeast India said you put 10 Metis scholars in the room and not one will agree. And in the period before the British come, there's a tremendous amount of coups in the court. There's a tremendous amount of conflicts between Rajkumas and like important Rajkuma families. And I think it's always been a place with strong emotions, strong contrasting claims to power, and I think maybe the British just weren't well equipped um, to govern. People ultimately don't want to be governed, and it's that kind of insecurity, um, and potentially because it felt like a remote place in the British Raj that led to um, people acting so poorly so often. Um, in Hodson's writing, he talks about the Ngami and he says, I know the Ngami, I've drunk his rice beer. One day he will be in Geneva arguing for self-determination in his kilt, and it will be a good thing for the League of Nations. So he can see the passion for self-determination. He can see the desire for different groups in Northeast India to have self-determination. They know they're not wanted. I think the British got on generally better in this period under Churchant than his son, and they're less kind about the subsequent monarchs as they headed to hand over power. They certainly didn't like the princes of the period, nor do the princes like them, and why should they?
Thank you.
Well, we have time for two more questions. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. This is my first time joining this session, so it's really good to see many people connecting from different country and universities. As a students of colonial studies, we really heavily rely on the texts and on the ethnographical works of D.C. Hudson, like the Métis, the Naga tribes of Manipur. But it seems to me that his ethnographical work are mostly written from a memory rather than the real observations, being he served only a few years in Manipur. So how should we see this kind of ethnographical work? It is really from the memory, because uh, how do we see this kind of historical text then as a students of colonial studies uh, who really see this kind of work as very important source of historical materials to study the ethno-histories of many tribals in Manipur? That is my question. Thank you.
That's a really great question. I do wonder that, if there are his field notes kicking around somewhere. Like at the Highland Institute, we published this Diary of Connie Shakespeare. It'd been a colonial document, first-hand notes. It'd been in an attic for a long while, then published. I think your idea that it's written from memory may well be right. I think it's in this book. Professor Kamai says the Naga tribes of Manipur is not a very good book. It's very confused. Very Elwyn says it's very confused. That does strike me as a book written from memory and way too ambitious in scope to do. Did he make notes of the Meti? I mean, he must have made great notes somewhere because of the references to the kind of did he just make notes about manuscripts or not the linguistic notes? Yeah, hard to know. I think it's a really great question, and yeah, anything that can be done to document early sources. Great. I tried to trace his family in case there is like an archive somewhere, but I've never found any of his field notes. But I did find maybe I can share it now. One document somewhere else about dreams. So he collected a lot of dreams among, just like Hutton did, among the hill tribes. And I don't think they appear in his writings fully. So he obviously made loads of notes and then sent them to other anthropologists interested in dreams. Let me see if I can bring it up, which suggests there is like a long list of field notes that may have got lost. But I do think also a lot has been written from memory. So it's a great question and one one I don't know about, but I could share it another time. But at the Royal Anthropological Institute is some longer notes on dreams, supposedly collected by Hodson, which suggests maybe a list of field notes exists somewhere that are not out in the public domain or have been lost in the passing of time. Yeah, I'm not sure I'll be able to find this picture. But
Right.
thank you so much for a lovely question.
I think question or comments, something that's remotely. What I like about a presentation was I think you have a lot of hidden message that relevant to today's political context. Uh, yeah. I think I have to rewatch the video once again, and somewhere I think the later half of your presentation are really great, some great learning lessons. But yeah, people just throw your questions. We have 2 more minutes.
I think I once used we to refer to the British, which made my own Freudian slip, because I was not alive for those administrative years. So it's funny once you introduce a framework, you catch yourself out. But it's a legacy that's like passed down. But how we repent for the sins of our ancestors, or who we choose to claim to ancestors, is always a difficult topic. One thing I would say is, like, alongside the Hodson biography, there is an interesting genre of local biographies. I love collecting Northeast India, but I find them so hard because they're so hagiographic to work out. People have written accounts of their grandfathers in the colonial times, or some of these early autobiographies. There's one of certain Mary Royal I have in mind. It's very hard from those uh, to unpick some of the same, like, extreme power without accountability.
If I may, can I ask one last question? All right. So my questions is, I think
Yeah,
your lecture
go ahead.
is
Go ahead.
okay. Your lecture is very, very important, considering the fact that we do not give that much importance to biographies and autobiographies. So, how do you see the biographies of these assistant political action in Manipur reflects the larger discourse of political history, military history, and also the self-reflexive analysis of the tribal history in colonial Manipur, considering how biographies are so much neglected in regional history like the Northeast India?
I think that's a great question. I mean, there's some great biographies out there of Elwin. Elwin has had Ramchandra Guha, wonderful gift of a biographer, witty, sharp, funny. And I think, if you're writing important people at this period, colonial ethnographers, Rajas, people who, like, edited local early vernacular papers, if we can write their biographies in non-hagiographic ways, it's better for all of us for understanding the works they produce and how we. So I don't know if that is a full enough answer.
So can you take over because my internet is really slow. Usually can you take over? Yeah.
Oh, just before we close, I'll say, actually, the book where Hodson's work was probably most read, his material most read, was this that came out later, post-war, Wild Thought, or Le Pont Savage by Claude Levi-Strauss. And this was there's loads and loads of references to Hodson's kinship work in here. There's one book where it's probably the best selling out of all the books ever referenced him. And yeah, it's a very different French book with almost no political ambitions at all, very different targets in mind. But thank you so much, everyone, for giving up some time to come listen to me. And thank you very much for the hosts and organizers for having me, and Katrina for gifting me this and being able to share that lovely story of mysterious divine justice. Who do the lies punish?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Edward, and everyone who had participated today. So with this, we close the session.